Please let's give a warm welcome for Kathleen Winter.
So thanks for coming out and coming to the library and braving the cold. And I just want to say, before I say anything else, thank you to the library for having me and for being here. I just read that in Newfoundland, where I lived for many decades, they're closing half of the libraries. It's half of the libraries in the towns and villages of Newfoundland are going to be no more. And libraries, as you know, are so important and have evolved with society so beautifully. And I don't know about you, but they've always been a second home to me, both for work and for just play and for socializing. And it's a really important community space, and I'm just so happy to share this time here in this library with you. This book, can everybody hear me okay? This book, Boundless, was in a way an accidental book for me. It was not a book that I ever planned to write. I got a telephone call earlier on a Saturday morning than I usually like to answer the phone. And it was author Noah Rischler, and he said, Kathleen, have you heard of those Russian icebreakers that go through the Northwest Passage and sometimes they take passengers? And I said, yes. And he said, well, there's one leaving and they like to have a writer on board. They have, you know, they have geologists and scientists, but they like to have a writer. And it's leaving next Saturday morning in a week. Would you like to go through the Northwest Passage? And I think, like a lot of people, I have always had in my heart a feeling of, you know, that would be the apex of adventure, would be to go and see the land of the far north. In my novel, Annabelle, it starts off with a kind of hymn to the beauty of the north in Labrador, where I had spent time and worked with people and worked with young people. And that northernness had so entranced me that I almost went to live in Labrador forever. It was just so magnetic and powerful. So the thought of going to the far north, to the Northwest Passage is not a real geographical location. It's more like a mythical story place. And so, of course, I said, my bags are already packed. Yes, I'm coming. So I went to the airport with the other passengers, the scientists, and you know, usually people in airports, they have this amazing look that I can never achieve, which is like the put together, I'm at the airport look. It's kind of really polished, but this crowd was not like that. They had, you know, their hats were stuck to their undershirts, were stuck to their long johns with various kinds of duct tape, and there was, you know, all kinds of paraphernalia. And these were, a lot of them were in their 80s and 90s. There was even a woman who was, I think, 100 years old. So not only were they intrepid they were lifelong adventurers, the people who were paying passengers to come up. They were lifelong adventurers who had been all over the world, and for many of them this was the first time they would see the far north. And I was honored to be with them. And really, I had no intention of writing a book, but between my own immigrant past, I mean, my father brought us to Canada from the industrial north of England when I was 8 years old. So we had a kind of New World narrative going on in our little family that I had never really explored. And between that and the idea of following in the exact steps of Franklin, which is what our ship wasn't supposed to do but ended up doing because of pack ice, we ended up following the exact route of Franklin. So between the inner narrative of being someone whose father had a New World dream, to following the footsteps of Franklin, and then to getting to know these passengers on the ship who each had their own story, I felt compelled to write down what I found. And this book is my attempt to make sense of those three storylines. Now, the most powerful one was the land itself. I was not emotionally prepared for what it would do to me and what it's like. Have any of you been to the far north? Quite a few. So you know, when you go on that land, if you walk on it, it's like a three-dimensional text without words of time, layers and layers of time. So we would see muskoxen, a muskoxen herd, they're so beautiful, they're woolly, it hangs down and they have these big woebegone eyes and they woofle together in this mass. It's like one big animal with many eyes before they stampede towards you down the hill. And beside them would be the bones of their parent and grandparent muskoxen. You know, so there's the bones and then the animals themselves and different generations of the animals. So there's that. And then there's all these sites where there'd be a kettle. And it would be a kettle that it's been sitting there on these stones for so long that the color of the kettle and the color of the stones are bleeding into each other as the kettle rusts and becomes part of the geology of the place. And you realize that that kettle must have come from somebody on board a European ship that got wrecked in one of the many attempts to search for the lost bones of Franklin. So, but it's still sitting there. You could almost make coffee in it now if it wasn't full of holes. It's just been lying there forever. And there's buttons and bits of people's toothbrushes. And then there's the wildlife. So it's these layers of incredibly profoundly meaningful artifacts that are all still there. And you walk across and you see it all and you're reading history without words. And it's all leading up until our presence here on this land today. So that affected me very much, and I wrote about it. And so what I want to read to you today is sections of the book that explore these three different threads: the power of the land, and the personal story of my own place on it in the New World, and also a little bit about the passengers. I found that I gained great love and respect for the other people on board the ship. And when you're on a boat with people for an extended time, it's as if you have a sort of contract together where normally the things that drive you crazy about people, you can get away from them, right? But on a ship, you can't. So there's a sort of social contract that happens that says, well, even though you think I'm insane and I think you're obnoxious, we're going to love each other for these weeks that we're going to overcome and forgive everything. There's a camaraderie and a forgiveness that lets people sort of respect each other and listen to each other's stories in an amazing way and find things out that you couldn't otherwise find out. So the first little bit I'll read to you is about the land itself. This is after we had crossed from Greenland, we had crossed the ocean, and we'd come towards Pond Inlet, which would be the first part of the so-called Northwest Passage. It's not every day a place retains the potency it had when it represented a dream or a wish. In front of me now stood mountains that something nameless had imagined out of crumpled light and the glow of sapphires. Namelessness had breathed substance into the light the way it had breathed breath into man, as if human bodies and the body of this land were negative versions of each other. Man, a breath-containing substance, and the north, a substance-imbued breath. The colors burned cold and intense: the turquoise Arctic water, the snow, ice, and purple mountains. And I felt the complete presence of a terrain that knows an absence of the markers that signify business as usual in the south. Light did not contain itself within southern boundaries, but sank into the water and land and made them glow. Light pulsed in and out of rock, ice and water, illumining strange crevices. This illumination entered my mind and cast light on thoughts hiding in the shadows. And it entered my body too, the same energy imbuing the land. My whole being became ignited in a hybrid world between thought and material process. Elizabeth joined me. She, along with Nathan Rogers, was one of the few people I ever encountered on the middle deck. We were coming into Pond Inlet, and I was glad of Elizabeth's restraint, because I wouldn't have wanted either of us to speak as the ship entered this world of effervescent newness. Turquoise water, purple and gold mountains, white mist. It was like being inside a wish, and was in fact that very thing, for wasn't the entrance to the Northwest Passage the essence of what my father and Englishmen before him had wished, gazing from cramped Britain towards sapphires and silk roads in what they called the Orient? And I had, somehow, yearning to follow my own filament of something elusive and glimmering, oriented myself into the center of the wish. Here were myself and Elizabeth alone on the deck of a ship, immersed in it. Everyone longs for a secret door, an opening to a world beyond loneliness. It's part of the human imagination. These Arctic hills, gold, purple, and blue, were achingly remote. The ship floated past, and they lay just beyond reach. Each breath was a cold shock, and the land was magnetic, like an encounter with someone who truly sees you. Yet we were offshore. It looks so unattainable, I said, gripping the white rails. Unattainable. Elizabeth savored the word with restrained laughter. Perhaps she was a woman who had no desire to attain anything. If she and I were both starving and we sat at a table on which someone placed a delectable piece of roast meat, I'd pounce on it, whereas Elizabeth would sit with her hands folded for an eternity, not eating a morsel unless it was offered by the person responsible for its appearance. She wouldn't even look hungry. But the land, I grappled, it's doing something. Elizabeth held an affinity with the moment, and her silence was a response. I knew the land wasn't sitting inert. It was acting on us, and I was unprepared. The land was a companion, alive. It had something to say, but we were too far off. It whispered and had a body. I hadn't known land had a body, or was a body, though people are forever saying a body of land, or for that matter, a body of water. I thought it a figure of speech, but now I remembered the words figure and body meant the same thing. I said, the land is a body, and I'm beginning to think it has something like speech. It is very eloquent, Elizabeth said. We stood together and held the rails, and I was glad the rails were white, a quiet color that held all colors and did not fight with the promises or whatever eloquence existed in the body of the land, eloquence standing in the mountains or reclining in the slopes. I was glad our ship was blue and white, the colors of the water, and that our spirits were quiet, Elizabeth's and mine, not chattering or trying to translate what was being said or held by the ground in front of us. I thought of promises ricocheting all over the South, on signs, in mouths, on TV and radio and online. Search no more, promised the signs. Here lies the end of your ravenous hunger in all its forms. Just step right up, ladies and gentlemen. We all knew the promises were fraudulent, but did we ever stop yearning? I remembered what our pilot said as we flew over the Ungava Peninsula and Baffin Island. There you are, folks, a whole lot of nothing. But this wasn't nothing. It was something. The land was present. Elizabeth and I were present to it, and there was a silent interaction. Something in the encounter, an elemental force, had begun to exert an influence. So that was how I felt about the land. And it took me a long time to be able to put it into words because it's a wordless feeling. Once the land had begun to exert this influence, I really enjoyed the fact that when we hiked on the land, we could go for some time alone as long as we didn't exceed the safety of the gun perimeter, which was people on guard to make sure that polar bears didn't attack us. So within certain confines, you could walk and you could be, in essence, alone on the land. And when I did that, a very powerful thing happened whereby I, for the first time, felt the separation between my mind and the air and the land around me wasn't what I thought it was. It was like it became porous, and it was as if, you know how sometimes you'll be at the ocean and there's a river or an estuary coming into the ocean and the two waters mingle, so the salt water and the fresh water mingle. It was just like I had never realized before that the planet is actually conscious. I mean, it just hit me that I'm with somebody. I'm actually with another being. And I sat with the consciousness, with the living planet in a way that I had never known before, and I think can only happen when you're in a magnificent landscape such as the far north alone. So these were all things that I felt and that I really wanted to write about. And the main reason I felt compelled to write about them was because we were not alone, humanly speaking. When we got to Pond Inlet, there were many members of the Canadian Armed Forces crawling all over the beaches with camouflage gear on, doing cold weather tactical military exercises with representatives of armies of other Nordic nations. There were quite a few of them. And this was a surprise to me. I guess it shouldn't have been. If I had been more versed in, northern politics, I would have realized this goes on all the time. But after that, everywhere we went, there was evidence of both military and economic presence in the north. One of the things that happened was that we crashed our ship after nearly its whole, we were going towards Kudluktuk, or copper mine, and we became grounded on an uncharted rock. And the ship came to a sickening crunch that lasted for about half a minute, and then it rested at a tilt upon this uncharted rock. And it had torn. It was a double-hulled ice-worthy ship, but it had torn and was damaged enough that we could go no further. The captain attempted to use, there's a very, very small tide of just a couple of inches. So over the next day and night, the captain tried to activate something called, I think they're called the bow thrusters, if I remember. And when these couple of inches more of water would come, we'd try with our own force, but there was no way our ship was getting off there. So we had to be rescued by the Coast Guard. And I had always thought, I had always thought that the Coast Guard has people on it that are guarding the coast, and it does. But the Coast Guard ship, which took 3 days to reach us, because we were really remote. It had to come a long way. It was filled with scientists who were working for British Petroleum and other mega oil corporations. And what they were doing was they were geologists on contract with these corporations and the government of Canada. And they were mapping the yet unmapped part of the Arctic Ocean floor, charting rocks such as the very one that we had just crashed on. And so it was a ship full of geologists, and their whole reason for being there was part of the military-industrial complex. It wasn't what we think of when we think of, or was what I had thought of when I thought of the Coast Guard. And they were lovely, and they rescued us, but between the people doing the military exercises and the geologists, working for British Petroleum, I realized on this trip that this singular power of the northern land has poised around it, ready for an exploitative kill, the likes of which the planet has only just begun to dream about. It's a huge change is happening in the North, both because of climate change, which is making some of these explorations possible, and just because of the natural progression of political and economic ambition. So for me, I'm a lyrical writer. I'm not, and I'm a novelist and sometimes poet. I thought, and there was so much of interest lyrically that I thought maybe I would write a novel. But as I became more and more immersed in the manuscript, I realized I just wanted to express to people the importance of what I had seen in the North and what it's like for a person who's not an expert. I mean, I'm not a big marine biologist or a small marine biologist or a geologist or anything like that. I was just a person who witnessed more beauty than I had ever seen before in my life, and more jeopardy in many ways. So one of the people on board mentioned in the part that I just read was Nathan Rogers, and he is the son of the singer Stan Rogers, who wrote the iconic song called The Northwest Passage that we all know. And he had been hired to sing his own music, but also sing the Northwest Passage in the Northwest Passage. And that turned out to be a profoundly difficult thing for him to do, and he and I became very good friends on the journey, and he figures largely in the book, because he was, I think, 4 years old when his father died on the Air Canada flight that there was a fire on board and he died. So Nathan is a musician who only knows his iconic father through the same means as we all know him, through the music. It's like he has to share his dad with the whole country through the music, and not through memory or anything. He can't really remember his father. So his story and the story of some of the other passengers became really important to me as well. And one of my jobs as a writer on board was that I was supposed to have dinner on the ship with a different passenger every night, to kind of, just because, you know, you don't want people just talking to the same people every night because they won't have as much fun. So, but for a writer, writers are usually introverts, and I'm an introvert, and I like listening more than I like talking. So I would really just love to listen to people's stories. And I heard so many beautiful stories that I had to put some of them in the book. And one of them concerns a small, wiry woman who were sitting together eating some, I think it was blackberry sorbet. They have really nice food on the boat. And she said, you know, my dad was Emily Carr's milkman. And I said, Emily Carr, the artist and writer? She said, yeah, my dad was a milkman and he used to deliver her milk. And one time, she was pretty old, she'd been running a boarding house. You know, Emily Carr had a very spotty economic life and she didn't always have money. And anyway, she was pretty old, this woman told me, Georgie told me. And Dad came home one night and told Mom at the supper table, Emily Carr can't pay her milk bill. So she wants to know, what do we want to do? Do we want to take a painting instead of money, or wait till she has the money? And her mother said, wait till she has the money. And just the thought of that interaction and the thought of the painting and how sad and awful that is, and how much I know about starving artists from, you know, my own life and my friends, I just thought that was a really beautiful story. But another aspect of it was that had the mother accepted the painting, they would have had one Emily Carr painting, they would have owned that painting. But because she didn't, it's kind of like when you haven't spent your money yet. You know, you can imagine, like knowing all of Emily Carr's paintings, you could sort of imagine, well, maybe we would have had this one, or maybe we would have had that one. And there's a lovely opening up of think of the possibilities of the painting we could have had. So there was a kind of nostalgic or yearning beauty to the story as well that I really liked. Another little passenger story I'll share with you, I'll read it instead of telling you, has to do with a mustard man. Hopefully I can find him here. I've got everything marked. Yes. So the geologists on board, I don't know if any of you are or know geologists, but it's like they get really excited about stuff that it takes an awfully long time to happen, but they think it's action-packed. So they think that, you know, something a 5-million-year-old rock did to an 8-million-year-old rock when they got together is almost like a sexual, like ecstatic, you know, dramatic event. And they'll get all passionate about these events, these geological events. I'm thinking, oh, for God's sake, get me out of the room and let me see a walrus or something, you know, that's alive now. I just had no patience. But I had an evolution. I had a real education, because we had expert geologists. And of course, we ended up getting grounded on a rock. And I mean, I'd say to the lead geologist, did you notice the full moon last night? And he would say, yes, it happened to be sitting right above a fantastically interesting section of non-gabrous sill. And I look at him, I go, it's the moon, man, it was a beautiful moon. But no, it was the rock under the moon that he was interested in. So when we crashed, I said, I suppose you know what we've crashed on. And he said, yes. I forget what it is, it's in the book, but he knew exactly what kind of course he did. He was a geologist. And then, well, just one more geology thing was that there were two Inuit women on board who became really my biggest teachers. And one of them, her name was Bernadette Dean. And her grandmother, Shoefly, had made some beaded garments that are down in the Museum of Natural History in New York City, and she, for a long time, wasn't even allowed to go look at them because they were in storage. And so the story of how Bernadette finally forced her way into the Museum of Natural History to bloody well look at her own grandmother's stuff was also in the book, and really, really interesting. But I said to her, after the trip, I want to go down and see your grandmother's garments. And she said, well, while you're down there, there's a meteorite that Peary took from Greenland. It's called Agnihito, and there's 3 pieces of it. It's like, you know, it's a meteorite, it's a big piece of metal. And the Inuit used to hack little pieces out of it and use it for tools through millennia. I mean, it was an important source of metal for tools in Greenland. But Peary, on seeing it, he got some Inuit to show him where it was. And he built a little, just for this purpose, a little piece of railway to move this thing to the ocean and put it on a boat and sail it to New York, where he gave it to somebody as a present. And it ended up in the museum, and they had to tear a hole in the museum to get it through. You couldn't get it through a door. Anyway, she said, you should go down and see that while you're at it. So I ended up being, you know, from somebody not interested in geology at all to somebody making a special trip to New York City to see a rock. And the whole aspect of the importance of land and earth and ground and what it nurtures and brings forth and brings into life became something that I really learned in spite of myself on this trip. But before I learned it, every time the geologist would point out something out the window, I'd scram over to the other side of the room. I didn't want to hear anything about it. And there was a big thing about non-conforming rocks. Everybody was always getting excited about those. As I tackled a perfectly poached egg on thin Russian toast, I did not rise as our geologist announced we should go on deck immediately to see a magnificent display of non-conforming rocks on the port side. I stayed until the room was cleared, but for a man administering something onto his food from a mysterious vial. The non-conforming rocks, visible through the windows, appeared to be a perfectly normal-looking ribbon of blue hills in the distance, each section conforming very nicely with the next in a continuous fluid line. What were non-conforming rocks anyway? They must be rocks that behaved in a way different from the rocks surrounding them, jiving when the others waltzed, partying as the rest studied for exams. They wore unconventional mantles and sprouted impossible lichen, and at night, as other rocks slept, the non-conforming rocks planned renegade activities. This took place over eons, visible only to those with deep vision who could assemble four-dimensional jigsaw puzzles of minuscule shards. Non-conforming rocks were nectar for our geologists and his disciples, and no doubt my truancy would come back to haunt me, but I was attracted to non-conforming events in moments passing now in front of me, in the atmosphere and personalities on the ship. I was interested when the man who remained with his mysterious vial said, "I am interested in mustard." Mustard? People are not nearly as interested in mustard as they should be. Aren't they? Mustard is a natural antimicrobial agent. The world is crying out for mustard. In the next century, do you know what farmers will be doing? They will put mustard into the soil before they plant their crops, and the caustic powers of the mustard will kill harmful microbes. Then, when the natural caustic gases have dispersed, the farmers will be able to plant their crops with no worries, no danger at all from the microbes which now infest their farmland. I hadn't noticed, but I notice now that Mr. Mustard's jacket bore a beautifully stitched insignia, Mustard 21 Canada Incorporated, embroidered within the fronds of a golden plant. He raised his vial and offered me its contents, a special preparation for spicing up one's shipboard meal. I was interested in this. I found it very non-conforming. So I really enjoyed the people on the ship. Another person who I enjoyed was a Japanese woman. She was a bird scientist, and her name was the name of a bird. Her name was Junko. And she would try to see certain birds, and she was actually a loon expert. And one of my jobs was to make sure that anybody following their passion didn't follow it over the side of the cliff or something. I was supposed to, you know, all of the staff members were supposed to just keep an eye. So I noticed Junko would go quite far, and I'd sort of hang out with her a little bit and make sure that if the polar bear guns went off, or the time happened when we were supposed to be heading back, that she would be with us. And so I learned a lot about loons, and she said, "I've written a little book about loons, and I'll give you a copy." And when we got back to the ship, I guess in Japan, books written by scientists about loons are not the same as here, because she had drawn pictures herself of the loons, and there was this really poetic and passionate account of a kind of fishing that's done with loons. And there's a kind of fish that the fishermen want, but they're really hard to get. And you kind of got to make friends with the loons over a really long time. Like, you go in your little boat. Well, first you give some rice to the gods at a shrine. And then you go in your little boat and you hang out with these loons. And you just wait until the loons start to trust you. The loons know you're not going to kill them. And then this coincides with the time that the loons start to dive for these little fish called sand lancers. And the loons are diving for the fish. But meanwhile, this is all sort of being herded now by the people in the boats. And there's a choreography going on, and the real thing that the fishermen are interested in is a bigger fish that eats the sand lancers. so that in the end you have a dance where the loons are forcing the little fish to go in a certain way that will force the big fish to come to the fisherman. So the loons help the fishermen to catch the big fish. Anyway, this was all in her book, but it was just this beautifully illustrated, choreographed dance that reminded me of the Picasso painting, Night Fishing at Antibes, and it's just like the lanterns and the fish. So she was so fascinating, and she was the foremost expert in her field of loons in Japan. And I just found it an incredible privilege to read her book and to talk with her on the shore and to include some of her expertise in my little book. I think the last thing I will read to you before I see if anybody wants to discuss your own travels with each other and with me or in the North or ask anything about the book. I'll read a little bit about where I was coming from in my own life before this life-changing journey. I had been married to a man who became ill and died. And I was moving house, and a lot of he was a writer, and painters had painted him a lot. He was a model for a lot of really great paintings, and I had some of them. So I had some of his old radio plays, and some of his special clothing, and some paintings that artists had made of him that I couldn't really bear to look at, and they were all in the dark shadows of the corner of the part of the house where I don't go. But now I had to confront them. And it was just before the Northwest Passage journey. One of the things that had happened when he was ill was that we had no money. Someone had given our name to agencies that gave out Christmas hampers, and we were given 3 turkeys, but had nothing to eat with them. When I tell my second husband about the turkeys, he says, "Why didn't you trade 2 of those turkeys with someone else for some vegetables and bread and cake?" Which seems like a sensible idea, but we cooked and ate the 3 turkeys. And when the last one was gone, we received a supper invitation from a Samaritan who did not know us well, but who must have known there was a dying man in the house and must have guessed we were hungry. She lived alone and was still working on the remains of her own turkey. She served us turkey soup. And I suppose she still thinks my tears on her tablecloth were tears of gratitude. When James died, a pall lingered. I had loved the little house we'd called our gypsy caravan, but it contained shadows from which I needed to free myself. This took time and involved shedding objects that had accumulated in hidden corners. One corner in the basement held many pieces of sadness, papers and paintings and mementos connected with James, along with special clothes he had loved. Anything I thought important to save for his daughter or his closest friends and family, I had saved and given. But there remained boxes and chests that contained dark and powerful memories, and before I could leave that house, I had to do something with them. "What you need," said Christine, my brother Michael's conjointe, as they say in Montreal, "is a Viking funeral." "A what?" "You gather the things, you bring them out to me in Western Bay. We build a raft for it all and get our dory and tow the raft out on the bay and set fire to it. I'll row you out." There was something so final and beautiful about this, I said yes. At sunset, I showed the last few things to Christine and to the little procession that had formed to see everything float and burn. "What about this? It's his wolf hat." "Burn it." And this, a copy of the Declaration of Independence on parchment that he made when he was into calligraphy. "That'll flare up nicely." "What about his medieval waistcoat?" "Throw it on the heap." Christine was a perfect boatman. In her pocket, she had a Mickey of vodka, which she'd chilled in the freezer, and every few minutes she handed it to me and I took a deep ceremonial swig. There was no doubt in her form or in her bearing about what we were doing. She looked as if she'd been the boatman for 100 Viking funerals. The onlookers, too, looked as if they had attended this sort of occasion for millennia, especially the children who did cartwheels over the wild grasses, which grew brighter and brighter green under the reddening sky. By the time we'd hauled the raft down to the beach, the sky was mauve and stars had come out. Christine had a bottle of lighter fluid in another pocket. She poured a hefty dose over James's possessions, then we climbed in the dory and the crowd pushed us out in the water. It felt great to float. I had total faith in Christine, in her ability to permeate James's things with flame accelerant, and in her taste in vodka and in her oarsmanship. Now it was just the two of us and the brooding sky, and the lovely, lapping, undulating salt water. I had never felt the rightness of any destructive activity as strongly as I felt the rightness of this one. In the dark, we could still see our friends on the beach, small now as we were far out in the bay. I want you to think about everything you want for the future, Christine said. And I want you to think about how thoroughly you're letting these things from the past go, how great that is and how it will free you. Her oars swished and dripped, and I loved that sound, and I loved what she said. She has long brown hair, and light from somewhere lit parts of it, and she's tall and strong. I felt I was in the hands of someone who knew what she was doing, even if only for the duration of this operation. Okay, I said. I'm going to soak the things in some more lighter fluid, she said, and here are the matches, and when you're ready, light the pile. She gave me the matches, and I lit one and held it to some of the papers. They weren't James' diaries. I'd saved those for his daughter, and they weren't our old love letters, which I still have in a black bag, but he'd kept carbon copies of radio plays he'd written and copies of his newspaper articles about art and research materials on the Shroud of Turin and Richard Brothers and the British Israelites and liner notes from vintage Gregorian chants and other things like that, which depressed me and drove me a bit nuts and which I never wanted to see again as long as I lived. I lit the papers. Light the medieval shirt. Light the wolf hat. There was something alchemical and primal and magical about seeing such a huge fire floating on the sea and knowing what it contained. There was always the thought, coming from some corner of life or of death or of the basement where the burning things had so long lain, that we shouldn't be doing this. But stronger than the thought came the feeling that it was liberating. I don't know how Christine knew how to conduct the timing of it all, but at some point, while the fire was still going, or was perhaps diminishing, she asked if it was okay with me that we slowly returned to shore. I said it was, and she rowed so I could continue to watch the flames, and she somehow timed it so that the very last flame, as it was burning small and lonely, I heard the pebbles of the shoreline schmizzle under our dory, and I felt the love and support and comfort of our shore companions who were silent now as we all watched that last flame. And as that flame died, what should Christine and her Viking funeral somehow bring to pass but from the eastern edge of the sky to the western hem, a slow, burning, blazing white shooting star. Now, the rocking of our ship gave me that feeling again, of land troubles falling away, dissolving. There was no line or corner in a wave, no way for cares of the world to hook or snag you. Floating up the southwest coast of Greenland toward the villages of Sisimiut, Ilulissat, and Upernavik was an extension of that healing journey in Christine's little Viking boat, unmoored and heading for the unknown. So thank you so much for listening. I really